everyone. I'm Sarah Piccini, the Assistant Director of the Lackawanna Historical Society, and thank you for joining us today for another Lackawanna Pastimes feature. Today we're celebrating the 100th anniversary of the Kohler and Fowler Acts, some of the first mine legislation that protected property owners from the dangers of mine subsidence. Today we're joined by Bill Conlogue, the author of Undermined in Coal Country. Bill teaches literature and writing at Marywood University and also a trustee of the Lackawanna Historical Society. So I'll turn the program over to Bill to talk about the history of mine subsidence in Lackawanna County.
Well, let me set a few things on the table in terms of context. So in 1904, Scranton had 116,000 residents, and there were 30 mines within the city limits and 140 manufacturing interests in town. By 1914, there were 135,000 people in town, and there were 27 collieries. Now, the city was 20 square miles, so there was more than one colliery per square mile, which is a lot, I think. And here's an example of what one of those looks like. This is the Marvin Colliery site, which is near, if you're familiar with 81, it's up near the Beaumont Mall below Marywood. So Interstate 81 would run through here. This is the mine opening. The coal was brought here to the breaker, and these are coal dumps, so waste coal piles. Up here is the Pancoast Colliery, so you can see the difference in size of operation. And then the Lackawanna River, this is Lower Troop, Upper Troop, and then Scranton down here. So these would be scattered across the city. So people were living right next to these colliery sites, and they were living on top, of course, of the mines. And there were 7 usable veins across the valley. Here's an example of what's underground. This is Marywood College, 13 acres. You can see the pillars are the white rectangles, and then the area that's mined out is in between them. And this, of course, is a gangway that would bring the coal to the surface, in this case, about a mile from where we are right here. And this is showing the underneath of the main buildings on campus. Now, this black line that outlines this area is to signal the area that was flushed in 1940. So this was backfilled in 1940. The pillars were left in place. So this ground is pretty solid. But you notice on the other side of the line, the pillars were taken, which is told to us through the hash marks that have been drawn through those rectangles. So just off in this corner here is this. So in 2004, there was a mine subsidence in the parking lot at Marywood, and it took down almost the whole spot. This was 5 or 6 feet into the ground. So it just backfilled and things were fine, but this is unstable ground back in here. So 100 years ago, this would be considered a nuisance by the coal companies. Of course, if your car fell in the hole, it wouldn't be a nuisance to you. But this is from 100 years ago. This is what a mine subsidence would do to utilities. Of course, as the city was expanding, the city was offering more electrical service, manufactured gas service, sewers were new, a lot of water lines were going in. And when a subsidence occurred, those things would be destroyed. So here's an example of water lines being disrupted, natural gas lines disrupted, signs, transportation, the trolley couldn't run, in addition to, of course, the danger of people falling into the hole. So this was a serious issue around the turn of the 20th century. Now, there are 2 types of mining, basically. One is first mining, where coal companies would go in and they would take up to 50 to 60% of the coal in the vein and leave those pillars in place to hold the surface up. In second mining, they would come back and take the pillars and take as much coal as they could. Second mining did not come into prominence until the 1890s, early 20th century. Prior to that, the technology wasn't available, so first mining was the rule of the day. In those years is when many of the properties in Scranton were sold by coal companies to homeowners, to businesses. And in those days, everybody assumed that things were going to be okay, that the surface would remain intact. There was no way that they could take the pillars out, and that it was a good deal for coal companies to sell to workers. Workers would be able to buy a place to live. The other thing that was happening in the early 20th century was more and more of the main companies, like Pennsylvania Coal, for example, were subcontracting their mines to smaller companies who were then beholden to the main company to sell their coal to. So they were often, or some of them were involved in cutting corners. They were actually robbing the pillars. They were taking pillars that they shouldn't take, which led to some mine subsidence. Now it got pretty bad over in West Side, and it came to public attention, especially in August of 1909, when late in August, just before school was to start, the number 16 school, which was then called General Lafayette, was destroyed by subsidence. And the company that had mined there last was People's Coal Company. And they were a small unit that seemed to be in the position of having caused several subsidences in West Side. This is what happened to the number 16 school. So it was wrecked. It was unusable. And there was a hue and cry about this, of course, and the rest of the neighborhood was also severely damaged. The Scranton Surface Protective Association was formed, and then there was much more pressure in Harrisburg to do something about this type of mining and renegade rogue coal companies. So the politics of the problem, I think, are pretty interesting because Scranton economically depended on mining. Most people were in some way connected to the mining industry, either as a worker or in employees of subsidiary and dependent industries. But Scranton also depended on solid ground. People had to live so that they could have a decent life, and that they wanted to have ground that they could depend on. And of course, all those utilities needed solid ground so that their operations were not disrupted. Other manufacturing firms needed solid ground so that they could continue their work. Mine subsidence was a public relations problem for the city too. There were national publications that were pointing to Scranton as a place that was going to fall into the earth because it was a subsidence problem. So industries would not locate in Scranton because of the fear of a subsidence. So the Scranton Surface Protective Association was a group of mainly middle-class folks who were interested in stopping the type of mining that was causing subsidence. Now, the agitation in Harrisburg led to a commission formed in 1911 to study the problem. So that commission came back to the legislature in 1913 with its findings. Now, the legislature in those years only met every other year. So this was the first time since the commission was approved that it brought its findings to the state. And its findings were not entered into the record. But what happened was the legislature passed two laws. One was to protect public highways. The other one was to protect private property. The governor vetoed the law that was to protect private property. So in 1917 and 1919, those laws were proposed again, and they were defeated. They were rejected. Meanwhile, the problem continued, and there was more and more subsidence in the city. Now, remember, too, that it's not happening just in Scranton. It's happening across the anthracite region. But Scranton was a particular problem and a focus of attention because of the number of subsidences and the spectacular nature of some of them, like the number 16 school. Now, when people were buying land in the mid-19th century, they were buying it from the coal companies. The coal companies were separating surface rights from subsurface rights. So when you bought a home or a piece of property, you bought only the surface. And the coal company included in the deed an exemption of responsibility for damages that may result as a result of subsidence. This particular waiver, which is called a cutthroat waiver, is the one in my own home's deed. So it's exempting, in this case, Pennsylvania Coal from any legal responsibility for damage to my house if there's a subsidence. So in the early 20th century, there was an effort to try to circumvent the cutthroat waiver. So surface rights, subsurface rights. Philip Mattis, an attorney in town who worked for the city on and off, he came up with the idea of a third estate, that if there is a right to have surface property and a right to have a subsurface property, coal mining rights, then there must be a right to support of the surface. That idea was tested in Penman v. Jones in 1917. Now, the context for this is that in 1891, just prior to a lot of pillar robbing and subcontracting, Lackawanna Iron Coal Company sold its coal to Lackawanna Iron Steel when it merged with Scranton Steel. But it didn't include a cutthroat waiver in the transfer of the property. So the theory is that Lackawanna Iron Coal retained the right to surface support at that time. So in 1915, when Lackawanna Iron and Coal is legally done with, it transfers its property to Scranton Trust Company, which is a bank. So the theory is that then that surface support right went to the Scranton Trust Company. So a guy named Penman purchases property from a guy named Matthews, who bought the land in the 1870s. And he had purchased it from the Scranton Trust Company. So his argument was that he had the right to surface support. He had the third estate. So he sells the property to a guy named Jones. And Jones says, okay, I'm going to buy this. Here's 10% down. But then Jones rethinks his purchase. And he comes to Penman and says, sorry, I'm not going to buy your land because I don't think you have the surface support right. So Penman sues him to get the 10% down payment back. And then that goes to the court system. And the decision is that Scranton Trust does, in fact, own this surface support right, the third estate. Now, the interesting thing about the case is that it only applies to areas that Lackawanna Coal and Iron own. So any lands beyond what is basically downtown Scranton and parts of the hill section were not affected by the decision. But it put in place the third estate right. Now, in one sense, that made it more difficult for other homeowners to get out of the cutthroat waiver because it recognized that there was a right to surface support, which is also, of course, a right to destroy the surface. So subsidence continued to happen. This example and the other examples that look like this are from a packet of photographs that went to the legislature in 1921 to advocate for support of the Kohler and Fowler bills that were then being debated. Here's another example of a photo that went to the legislature. This is in Cathedral Cemetery. This is a gravesite that was undermined and the casket's destroyed. The woman's hand is visible. And of course, it's ironic that children are seeing this. So there was an interesting propaganda campaign to support Kohler and Fowler. And of course, the coal companies were engaged in their own propaganda campaign to stop their passage. So the Fowler Act and the Kohler Act were passed at the same time on May 27th, 1921. Now, one of the things that was going on at the in May of 1921, when these two acts were passed, was that the House in the legislature was in a little bit of an uproar because the speaker had to be replaced, and this was happening at the very end of the session. So these acts were passed in the midst of a dust-up among the legislators. Anyway, the Fowler Act taxed coal to repair subsidence damage. So 2% of coal mined, marketed, there was a 2% tax on coal. Now, companies could avoid the tax if they agreed to abide by the Kohler Act. Nobody chose to pay the tax. So that meant that Kohler would have been enforced. The Kohler Act prohibited companies from mining in ways that would endanger the surface, which was basically second mining, robbing the pillars. Companies argued that this would put companies out of business because they needed to mine in this particular way so that they could make a living. And it was keeping them from their rights to their property. So again, the acts were meant to avoid the cutthroat wave. Sorry. There it is. This is part of a campaign that the Scranton Surface Protective Association was waging after the acts were passed and as they went through the court systems. So the Scranton Surface Protective Association was warning people not to sign petitions that the coal companies were sending door to door to sign people up to oppose the acts. And in January of 1922, when the acts were being debated at the level of the state Supreme Court, the Scranton Surface Protective Association made a movie that they were showing in Scranton. It was called Scranton Redeemed. So if the acts are fully vetted and passed and enforced, then Scranton will be redeemed from the nightmare of the cave evil. So that was shown in different parts of the city, and then it was shown in Schuylkill County, from what I understand. The Delaware, Lackawanna, and Western Railroad, after the acts were passed, and just prior to the governor's signature, they came out and announced that they would pay 100% of all damages to caved properties. Now, right after Penman v. Jones, they had said, well, we'll pay up to $5,000 if your property is damaged. But now they're coming out and say, well, pay everything. This was an attempt to get to the governor to veto the acts if more companies were going to come on board and say, well, we'll take care of everything. So Kohler put the coal companies in the position of having to take legal action. So the acts were passed in May of 1921. They were enforced in August of 1921. Almost immediately, Pennsylvania Coal Company set up a test case in September. So a guy named Harold J. Mahan, who's living in Piston, who was married to a woman who her father was tied to Pennsylvania Coal. And I think Mahan was an attorney for Pennsylvania Coal. So the coal company sent him a letter and said, we're going to mine under your house. And Mahan sued, saying, you know, I don't want these people to be mining under my house. You got to stop them from doing that. So it went to the Luzerne County Court. Now, the interesting thing about this, of course, is that it didn't happen in Lackawanna County, where there would have been much more public pressure on the court systems, I guess. So it was brought to Luzerne County Court systems. And there weren't as many subsidences, and there wasn't as much uproar in Luzerne County as there was in Lackawanna County. But anyway, it goes to the Luzerne County Court of Pleas, and the judge, whose name is Fuller, didn't even hear arguments. He brought the lawyers in and said, all right, no injunction. This is a property case. Pennsylvania Coal has every right to mine under this guy's house, so it's over. Well, it's appealed. So the Pennsylvania State Supreme Court, they hear the case in April of 1922, render a decision in June of 1922, overturning the Luzerne County Court's decision, and they stop Pennsylvania Coal from mining underneath Mahan's home. Well, Pennsylvania Coal wasn't happy then, so they took the case to the US Supreme Court, and notice how fast this is moving. May 1921, the acts are passed. By the next year, you have the Pennsylvania Supreme Court ruling on this, and then it goes immediately to the US Supreme Court, and they hear arguments in November of 1922 and render a decision in December. And that overturns the Pennsylvania State Supreme Court ruling. Pennsylvania Coal v. Mahan is a really, from what I understand, and I'm not an attorney, but this is a really important case in American legal history. The key question in the case was, did the Kohler Acts restrict mining to the extent that it amounted to an unlawful taking of property? So it became a Fifth Amendment issue, of course, when the Kohler Act was passed. The decision was almost unanimous, and the decision was yes, this was an unlawful taking of property because you were denying Pennsylvania Coal access to its property, its coal. And two of the most famous Supreme Court justices were hearing the case, Oliver Wendell Holmes and Louis Brandeis, and they split on the decision. Holmes wrote for the majority saying, this is a property rights case, and these people had waived their right to surface support, so Pennsylvania Coal is within its rights to go in there and mine. Now, Brandeis said, well, no, there's got to be some exception to that right. And his argument was, well, a nuisance exception, that if there's enough harm to property owners, then the state can intervene and should intervene and say, stop. A couple of problems here. One is that this was happening in one part of the state. Kohler and Fowler were about anthracite mining. They weren't about bituminous mining or copper mining or any other kind of mining. They were about anthracite mining, which is only 400 and some square miles of the state. And it was really about Scranton, where all the trouble was happening. And it wasn't really about Scranton so much as it was about the west side of Scranton for some observers. So there was a small number of people who were involved from one perspective, the coal company's perspective. And that's how Holmes was seeing it. Brandeis was seeing this as a public problem, that mining like this could endanger the public, and the public he's defining as all those who are affected by anthracite mining. So Pennsylvania Coal v. Mahan redefined eminent domain, the state's police power to take your property. Now, before this, it was the physical taking of property. The state could come in if it needed to for a public benefit or for public safety issues to take your property. If they wanted to build an interstate through where you're living, they could come in and say, you know, we need this for the interstate. Here's fair market value for your house. So it was all a physical taking. With Pennsylvania Coal v. Mahan, it became a regulatory taking doctrine. So that the state, in regulating your property, your use of your property, access to your property, could then take your property without compensation, as they could. Well, eminent domain, they would have to give you compensation. Regulatory taking, there wasn't compensation. So the case posed a problem that nobody's resolved even today. Where's the line between the seizure of property and the regulation of it? So there's a line somewhere where you can regulate property and the use of it enough that it ends up being a seizure of the property. So where is that? Now, mine subsidence continued after Mahan. In one sense, this gave a green light to the coal companies that they could mine as much as they wanted, wherever they wanted. So second mining was okay. So it continued, and subsidence has continued. Now, at the same time, you get into the 1930s, the Great Depression. People are desperate for work, for coal, for heat, for cooking food, and people end up digging their own mines. Bootleg mining was happening in the region, and people were digging into their basements to take coal. They were creating sheds and establishing mines through the shed, and they were not particularly careful about surface support. So sometimes they would undermine their own homes, and subsidences would take place. And very few of these bootleg mines were backfilled or mapped, so people didn't know where they were. A very famous case of mine subsidence happened in 1944 that killed a child, 10-year-old child in Pittston, Julianne Fulmer. So she and her aunt come out of a grocery store and are walking down the street. The child drops behind only a few steps and then disappears into the earth. So they bring in equipment to try to rescue her. She's found dead. So there was an uproar around her death. Her father was serving in the military, and he was brought back from the front to attend the funeral. Now, subsidences continue to happen in Scranton. The building that Lackawanna College just purchased, that was they were dealing with a mine subsidence under that building, Adams and Mulberry Street. 2012, there was a subsidence under Midtown Apartments. If you go back a little bit further into the early 80s, you may remember the equipment operator who was filling an abandoned mine in the Pinebrook section. The equipment fell into the hole and he was killed. So as others were saying before, flushing was happening in the 1960s and 70s to fill those spaces between the pillars. The theory was that if you mix waste coal with water, take down the cone piles and shove them back under the ground, then you'll have surface support. So this was happening across the city. People were going into the mines, and they were putting the cone between the pillars. That would harden, and then it would form a support for the surface. Now, for example, people were talking about how much space there was underneath downtown Scranton in the 1960s and 70s. The historic cone pile, which had taken 30 years or more to build up, that was put under the University of Scranton in the 1960s, and that took 16 days of trucks running 24 hours to move that underground. Anyway, so we're still dealing with mine subsidence. The state has reclaimed about 2,800 acres of ground across the Commonwealth at a cost of $136 million. A lot of this is coming from attacks on the modern coal industry to reclaim land. And of course, still a lot of it is coming from taxpayers. That's all I got, Sarah.
Thank you very much, Bill. That was very interesting. I will turn it over to questions, but I'm going to start because I have a question to start with.
Okay.
Bill, you mentioned that there was less issue with subsidence in Luzerne County. Was it the people in Luzerne County were more willing to put up with it, or was there just less subsidence due to deeper mines or better pillars or whatever?
My understanding is that there were fewer subsidences.
Okay.
One of the troubles that was happening in Scranton is that these subsidences were happening on a fairly regular basis, especially in West Side. And a lot of that was due to, again, People's Coal Company mining in a way that was dangerous. And that dangerous beyond the danger of second mining itself. So they weren't paying close enough attention to safety surface issues.
Okay.
That's my understanding.
Okay, that makes sense.
And of course, the Scranton was much more concentrated, and it was a bigger space too than many places in Luzerne County then.
Sure. Okay. Does anyone else have questions? Don, go ahead.
Yeah, Bill, the flooding that happened up in Dixon City last week before on Dundas Street, did that have anything to do with mine subsidence?
My understanding is that it didn't, and that it was due to the burial of a stream in a culvert, and it filled up with rock, and then that forced the water to the surface. So it broke through the culvert, and it wasn't mine subsidence.
Yeah.
What I read.
So Dixon City did have a mine subsidence near the bank on Main Avenue not many years ago. So,
Thank you.
Ella, did you have a hand up before?
Huh?
Maybe
I
not.
have
Ella,
a
were you raising your
question.
hand or were you just kind of waving?
Me?
Yeah, you.
Yeah, I've got a comment.
Okay.
In the book I wrote on Trinity Congregational, and Bill, I think, read it some time ago.
Yeah.
I capture the information that Plymouth Congregational Church, which was on Jackson Street, just above Main Avenue. It's a big parking lot now for Jackson Baptist. They kept having mine subsidence through the teens and 20s, and did get involved in the various legal processes, trying to sue and get money to help rebuild the damage to the church. And I figured out in today's valuation, it was about $2 million over time that they had to spend out of their own pocket. They
Wow.
did sue People's Coal Company, and in the valuation of the 1920s, they got $2,000 from the courts. And they were involved in this Fowler Act and all the other acts. So I didn't feel that there was much justice for this particular organization, but of course I had at that point the 21st century view. And I've looked at the coal mine maps for under St. Luke's, not Congregational Episcopal Church on Wyoming Avenue. And as you may remember, for some of you in the area, St. Luke's has a wedge committee that goes and props up the church every so often. And working with a structural engineer that I know here in town, plus the priest, and looking at the maps, and then talking to John Palumbo the other day, and the Dunmore 1, the Dunmore 2 run underneath that area, and a third one I forget. But we're thinking it's not really so much the mines under that area as the lily pond. And it's still a soggy bog, which is creating problems to today, 2021, with some structural shifting going on in the church itself, in the sanctuary area, more so than in Troop Memorial Hall.
Yeah.
Yeah, and I know when I was reading this, working on St. Luke's history, I think it was the 1950s. I've sort of forgotten the date because I didn't pay a lot of attention to it. The coal companies came around, and I'm not sure which one it was, Lackawanna Iron Steel or whatever in the 50s, offering to sell the coal rights to the property owner. And next door, which is now the congressman's office, the owners of that building did buy the coal rights.
All right.
St. Luke's did not, because they didn't have enough money.
Mhm.
Because they were just, typical church doing day-to-day operations. So I thought that was kind of interesting to throw at you too.
Yeah, I've read that some people who did buy the pillars underneath their homes, it didn't really matter because the coal company took them anyway.
Okay. Okay. So,
They didn't know what was going on underneath them. So
so the
I
best
think the city sued, I think, Strand Coal Company for mining underneath the library at one point because they were taking coal that the city thought or claimed that it owned. So there was real robbing going on in those cases.
Yeah, basically, coal mines well earned their reputation of being nefarious.
Yeah.
Uh-huh.
Anyone else? Delita, did you have a question or something to add before? Oh,
You're
still
on,
muted,
you're on
Delita.
mute, Delita.
I did have a question. I can't remember what it was because I was listening to everyone talk, so I forgot what it was.
That's
Sorry.
your excuse. Gee, I was listening.
That's all right.
I was listening.
Bill,
Go ahead, Doug.
I understand that there was a whole section of town over in West Side below St. Lucy's, like between 7th Avenue and up, and the whole section settled down,
Yeah.
almost to the river.
Mhm.
Is that true?
I've heard the same. Yeah.
Well, I'll tell you what, I lived on Broadway and I remember everything below the ice house along 7th Avenue settling up to Scranton Street. All those homes were taken down. The
Yeah.
railroad tracks there was a 3-track main line for the D&W Bloomsburg branch, and there were 4 tracks for the Hyde Park yard. They used to store coal hoppers, and all of that just collapsed. There was tracks hanging in the air. So yeah, that did happen in my lifetime, and I saw it.
Yeah.
Yeah.
You know,
I mean,
Emmett
when
Creek was okay.
Yeah, when you think of mine subsidence, you think of a hole in the ground, but this was blocks that
Yeah.
went
It
the
was,
same
it was
time.
quite a few blocks. Yeah.
Yeah.
And
Well, the
Yeah.
twin shaft disaster, that was a subsidence really, and that killed 58 men, I think, and it was covering several hundred square feet of the surface, subsiding all at once. So,
Yeah.
yeah.
Amazing.
And then there were cases in Pittston where people came out one morning and their backyards had all
Yeah.
fell. So they used to be able to just walk out their back door into their backyard. Now they had to build steps to get down to their backyard.
Yeah.
Well, what was part of the cause? I obviously I got the impression it was mismanagement or whatever took place, but did they not have enough columns to hold up the earth? We'll put it that way, that to prevent the subsiding of earth in homes. What would you say the main cause was?
Well, I think the main cause, depending on where you were, that, for example, in some places in the earliest mining, they weren't really keeping the pillars on top of each other because there was more than one vein, and you need to keep them all on top of one another
Okay.
to keep the surface intact. So older mined out places may have had that issue. In other places, I think it was a real thinning of the pillars, that they were taking pieces to the point where the pillar was too thin and it just broke, subsided. And then in other places, they took the entire pillar and they took too many of them.
They took
Too many of the pillars, and they took,
away.
took all of them.
Yeah.
What were they made of?
Account for how the ground would settle.
What
And
were
even
they?
for backfilling didn't really fill the entire hole because it would settle, of course. So you'd still have space between the flushing material and the roof of the mine.
Mhm.
And then it was found that it could settle as much as a third or more. So the space would be pretty big.
I see. What were the pillars made of? Was it steel? The
No, they were
pillars.
made of coal. It was the coal that they left in the ground to hold the surface.
And they just left it.
That's
left
what they wanted to come in to rob
That
them.
doesn't sound strong enough to me.
Yeah,
I guess it was.
it was in most cases, yeah. But then when they took them out, of course, it was there was less strength there to hold the surface.
Mhm.
Yeah. And then I think even the title of this session, City on Toothpicks, didn't they put wood then, like tree trunks and things up to support the sections that they took out, which of course would rot away over time.
Well, the tree trunks, the props, they were
Yeah.
to hold up the roof of the mine, really, not to
Yeah.
hold the whole surface. So
Yeah.
that the miners wouldn't be hit with falling rock that had become loose because of mining.
What a
Yeah,
job.
there is a whole dead forest of trees down there somewhere.
Yeah, right. Oh my.
Yeah, I know, in looking at the surviving weekly reports over at Steamtown of the Laurel Line, they were constantly, especially down in Jenkins Township, constantly just filling in subsidence and placing watchmen. It was very expensive for sometimes for months around the Butler Colliery. They actually relocated the main line because there was coal robbing going on. And sometimes the mines told them there was coal robbing. Sometimes they said nothing.
Yeah.
All of a sudden, I know there was a big collapse in Pittston, and it was really in the evening. And because there's a record of a southbound Laurel Line train being stopped by just a civilian out there before it went into a hole. And
wow.
then the operator ran down to get the northbound to stop. And it was around the North Pittston station. So
No.
between the Pittston line and and the other side, I can't think of the name of the place right now. And the southbound was just full of people coming from Luna Park.
Wow.
So that could have been a disaster. But there was a huge section of Pittston that went in at that point.
Yeah, I've read about cases where trains had been derailed because of the subsidence. There were trainmen who were killed in different incidents. And also there were explosions, houses that had their gas lines cut in the middle of the night. The gas fills the house, hits a light fixture or a candle, and boom, the whole place goes up. And into water, sometimes filling basements, people's coal supply disappearing in the basement. In 1930, there was a guy who got a patent for a mine subsidence, I guess, preventative device that he had attached to attached steel rope to the sills of the house. So if the basement went out, the structure would remain intact. So that guy was from Taylor, and Taylor had some serious mine subsidence problems too. But anyway.
Yeah, my grandparents lived in what was called the Patch along Oak Street, and that whole area was demolished because of mine subsidence.
My grandfather, who grew up in Dunmore, claims that one day 2 miners walked out of his basement.
Oh my God.
I'm not claiming that's a true story.
I guess who came to dinner.
It wasn't.
I have actually read an account where that happened. Was it around Cherry Street, or because
He lived on Walnut. In
that
Dunmore.
there was a subsidence underneath the house, and the women in the house put a ladder down for 2 miners to come to the surface. And it was across the street that the house that I was thinking about when I was telling that story. That's the house that blew up. That the gas line had been cut, and it exploded, and it damaged, of course, the houses around it across the street. But the explosion blew a child into a tree, and the child was there for a half hour before anybody discovered her. And
Wow.
the whole family was killed, except for the father, who was at work as a security guard at Scranton Gas and Water. And when he heard that this had happened, they had to subdue him because he pulled a pistol. He was going to kill himself. So these are the kinds of obviously ripple effects that happen with.
Well, my good friend Ed Miller, who I'm sure was on your board at one time, I would visit him many times to talk about the Loreline, of course, but he remembers as a younger boy being on his porch on Mill Street, the upper part of Mill Street, and remembers a 5-7-year-old girl walking on the sidewalk on the other side of the street, and the ground let loose and they never found her.
Is that Julianne Fulmer?
I
in the 40s?
I don't know who it was, but
Because it was Mill Street in Pittston where that happened.
yeah, but Ed remembers telling me, I remember him telling me that.
Oh, that's incredible. Yeah. There was another child that was that fell into a mine cave a week or so after that. He was on the way to get a haircut and fell in, but he was able to crawl out himself. So there are people in their backyards trimming their flowers or raking leaves, and boom, all of a sudden the ground would open up and they'd be 10 or 12 feet in the ground. So it'd be scary.
So after,
In West Side, where a child was at play outside and there was a mine subsidence, and the concrete wall next to him fell and killed him. And then Forest City, one more story, sorry, where the ground collapsed underneath a horse and wagon, and the horse was struggling to get out. People were trying to get the horse out, but the hole filled so quickly with water that the horse was drowned because of the break of a water main.
so with all the mine flushing that happened, is it safe to live in Scranton, or should everybody move to Clark's Green?
You might be onto something, Don, just in case. Joining us to talk about this important topic and observe this 100th anniversary this year. Please join us again next time on June 4th, where we'll be doing something a little different. The Historical Society staff, Marianne and I, will be talking about some of our favorite secrets from our archives. Talking a little bit about some of the research tools that we have in our collection, and also unveiling some of our favorite stories that we've uncovered in the process of our own research. So hope you can join us again on June 4th, same bat time, same bat channel, for another Lackawanna Pastimes feature. Thank you, everybody, and have a great weekend.